What's good everybody, this is CP and welcome back to another fantasy basketball video. Just a quick disclaimer here, do not blindly follow all the information I'm about to share in this video. Like everybody else, I could be completely wrong. So the most important thing to do is do your own research and make your own final decisions. So let's not waste any more time and 走起吧. So today I'll take a look at some of the top fantasy basketball players to draft this season, and I will try to predict some of the top players for a few major fantasy categories, including some dark horse candidates and sleepers that could outperform their position. Now starting with the first major fantasy category, I'm going to take a look at points per game. And here's a quick look at the top 10 lists from last year. For the most part, I feel like if you're going for points, anyone in the top 10 should be a pretty safe pick, granted that they stay healthy all year. And I feel like a name like Steph Curry should be one of the safest picks to remain in the top 3, mainly because his efficiency is crazy good. He's one of the best shooters of all time, and not many fantasy players can hit triples at the same rate as Steph Curry does. Meanwhile, similar to the last few years, I would say players like Kyrie, Joel Embiid, and even Kevin Durant to a certain extent are the riskier picks for this category, as health is always a concern for these players, and history shows that they are very likely to miss a good amount of games this season. So if they sit out at the wrong time, they could actually cost you several weeks or maybe the entire season. And out of everyone on that list in the top 10, I feel like names like Luka, Zach LaVine, and Zion has the most upside to set new career highs this upcoming season, in that they're all still very young and can still find an extra gear to score more efficiently. Especially with a player like Zion, if he develops a reliable 3-point shot or even a mid-range shot and shoots better at the line this year, I feel like he has a shot to average over 30 points per game this year. So Zion Williamson is one of the names that you might want to look out for in the points per game category. Another name who I think is a bit underrated is Donovan Mitchell of the Utah Jazz. I feel like sometimes he's a bit overlooked, maybe because he plays in a much smaller market, and many people are blinded by flashier names such as Steph Curry, KD, Kyrie, and Jason Tatum. However, we can't forget that Donovan Mitchell was tied for 10th in points per game last year, and he could easily work his way into the top 8 or even top 6 this year if he continues to improve his offensive game. And heading into this season, Donovan Mitchell is also the Jazz's best offensive player, as the stats show that his usage went up for 4 straight seasons. He also increased his triples per game by almost 1 full triple last year, and averaged a career high of almost 21 field goal attempts per game last year. So based on those stats, you can see that Mitchell's fantasy game is trending up year by year. And if Mitchell is a little bit more efficient with his shooting, I think he has a shot to average 28 points per game this year. Now going further down the list, notice how only 17 players averaged 25 points or more last year. So in my opinion, if you miss out on an elite fantasy scorer early in your drafts and still want to remain competitive in this category, you'll need to find ways to make up for it in the middle to late rounds. And one more key thing to point out here is that there wasn't one rookie in the top 30 in points per game last year. So that's one very important thing to keep in mind. And if you want to go after scoring, it might not be such a good idea to depend on rookies because their stats are just too hard to forecast. Now going further down the list, I feel like a name like LeBron James might continue to decline as he has more help now in LA with Westbrook and Anthony Davis together. So in a way, I think the trio kind of handcuffs each other's fantasy stats, because quite realistically, the Lakers could give LeBron or Westbrook some nights off and let their other star take over. So if you need them for a very important night, they might sit out and lose 20 points for you. So that's one thing to keep in mind as well. Now going down the list, James Harden is another huge question mark for me, because he did have a bit of an off year last year by his standards, averaging only 24.6 points per game. Obviously, there's a chance that he can bounce back and be a plus 25 point per game player. However, we can't forget that he's now a member of the Brooklyn Nets and he's sharing the ball with Kyrie and KD. So I think a lot of Harden's stats depends on how healthy Kyrie and KD is. With that in mind, I'm not so optimistic about Harden being able to average close to 30 points this year. And realistically, if all goes well for Harden, I think he averages closer to 26 to 28 points per game. Now going further down the list, I feel like Colin Sexton is still one of the most underrated players for point per games to go after. He's not a player that people draft in the first or second round, but I pumped his tires for 2 straight seasons, and the kid keeps improving year after year, so there's no reason to doubt that he can't average over 25 points for the first time in his career this season. Another name I'm high on in this category is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander of the OKC Thunder, and I believe he could be one of the biggest risers in this category because he dealt with some injury problems last year and still managed to finish as a top 25 player in points per game. Heading into this year, SGA should be the Thunder's primary scoring option, and we can't forget that he's still quite young at the age of 23, so if he can stay healthy, I feel like he can improve his offensive game and average closer to 25 or 26 points per game this year. Now the next name might be a little bit of surprise for some of you, but I feel like Paul George might be one of the biggest bounce back players in this category. Mainly because for one, Kawhi Leonard is hurt, and we're not too sure when or how effective he will be when he comes back. And secondly, the Clippers didn't really do much in free agency and didn't really bring in too many good reinforcements. So if anything, I feel like the Clippers need to depend on Paul George to carry the team offensively, especially early on in the season. So in that sense, having Paul George might be able to give you a really good head start in your leagues. Also, one stat to remember is that Paul George actually did average a career high of 28 points a few seasons ago with the OKC Thunder, playing alongside Russell Westbrook. So now I would argue that he's actually in a better fantasy situation this year with no other all-stars beside him. Another pick for a potential riser in this category is Fred VanVleet of the Toronto Raptors. He was actually the 46th best player in points per game last year, averaging almost 20 points per game. However, we can't forget that he was sharing the court with Kyle Lowry, and now with Lowry gone, I feel like it's Freddie's team and he's gonna run the point guard and probably be one of the highest used offensive players on the Raptors. And one thing to point out is that his points per game average improved for 4 straight seasons, and quite frankly, I don't think he's done improving yet. So I wouldn't be surprised to see steady Freddie average closer to 22 to 25 points per game and be a top 30 player in this category to finish off the season. Now moving on to another key fantasy category, let's take a look at triples. Unlike points per game, I think this category is a little bit harder to predict in that sometimes new players and non-all-stars emerge every year. If we take a look at the stats from last year, Steph Curry led the way along with Buddy Hield and Dame Lillard. Meanwhile, Duncan Robinson and Terry Rozier rounded out the top 5. One key thing I wanted to point out here is that only 9 players in the entire NBA made over 200 triples last year. So if you're able to get an elite name like Steph, Dame, or Buddy Hield, they might have the ability to single-handedly carry you through some tough weeks in the 3-point category. Very important point to keep in mind. Now, if you want to build your team around triples, I feel like Steph and Dame Lillard are considered the cream of the crop, especially when you compare those two to everyone else in the top 5. It's kind of obvious that both Steph and Dame are legit top 10 fantasy players who can also get you elite numbers in the other major fantasy categories. However, if you miss out on an all-star, I wouldn't panic too much because, to be quite frank, the 3-point category is one of the easiest categories to find on the waiver wire. And I believe names like Duncan Robinson, Joe Harris, and Tim Hardaway Jr. can either be drafted in much later rounds or even be picked up on waivers on some smaller leagues. Now, looking at everyone else in the top 10, I would say that it's very hard to find a well-rounded fantasy player who is also elite in triples. And besides Steph and Dame, I would say that Luka and Jason Tatum are your next best bets. Once again, I feel like Fred VanVleet of the Raptors is a player I'm very high on in terms of triples this year. He was ranked 19th in the league last year, making 174 triples in only 52 games played. If he plays a full season this year with a bigger offensive role granted to him on the Raptors offense, I really think Steady Freddy has a legit shot to knock down over 200 triples and be somewhere in the top 10 or top 15 to finish off the season. Now, one name who can surprise some people in this fantasy category is Lonzo Ball of the Chicago Bulls. Credit to him for significantly improving his shot since his early rookie days, but if last season is any indication, I feel like Lonzo Ball should be considered a legit 3-point shooter. And fantasy-wise, I feel like he could finish in the top 10 or top 20 for triples made, because in only 55 games last year, Lonzo knocked down 172 triples and posted a new career high in triples made and 3-point percentage, averaging 3.1 triples per game at almost 38%, which is pretty amazing if you compare those stats to his rookie season in LA. After analyzing the stats for triples, I would say that it's very rare to see a power forward or a big finish in the top 20 in triples made. In fact, Nikola Vucevic was the only big who finished in the top 20 last year, knocking down over 175 triples in 70 games. Besides that, Julius Randle was the only big who made it in the top 40 for triples made in fantasy basketball. In that, if triples are important to you, then I think a player like Vucevic or Julius Randle might hold more value than other bigs who can't shoot three-pointers at all. Going down the list, I feel like Michael Porter Jr. is a player who has a lot more potential to grow in this category, because in his first full season as a starter, he was 25th in this category despite only playing 61 games last year. I feel like he can continue to improve and finish this upcoming season as a top 20 player in triples made. One dark horse to pour it on later in the season. Just looking at some quick stats here, Klay averaged 3 triples per game from 2014 to 2019, so 5 straight seasons, and has a career high of 44% from beyond the arc. So if people let Klay slip in your drafts, and if you're able to take him at a much later round, he might be able to outplay his draft position and be a huge game changer for your team in the triples department. With that said, I feel like Klay might be one of the biggest bounce back candidates in this category.